To the rest of the universe, humanity was nothing more than a fragile footnote in the galactic registry. But when a ruthless alien warlord decided to brutally kick a retired mechanic's terrier just for barking, he didn't just pick a fight. He awakened a dormant apex predator and brought an entire interstellar empire to its knees. The orbital station Aegis Prime was a rust bucket hanging on the edge of the Perseus Arm, a place where the galaxy's forgotten went to vanish. For Jack Halloway, it was paradise. Jack was a man whose face looked like it had been chiseled out of worn granite. He spent his days buried elbow-deep in the grease of civilian transport thrusters, running a modest repair bay on level 4. But Jack was rarely alone. Trotting behind him, usually carrying a grease rag or a dropped wrench in his mouth, was Barnaby. Barnaby was a scruffy, 30-pound terrier mix, part wire hair, part mutt, and entirely Jack's world. When Jack's wife had passed away 5 years ago down on Earth, Barnaby was the only thing that kept the man from putting a heavy-caliber round through his own ceiling. The dog was his anchor to humanity. The broader galactic community didn't understand dogs. To the reptilian and insectoid species that dominated the core worlds, the idea of keeping a non-sapient, non-edible predator in one's living quarters was baffling. But humanity had insisted on bringing their pets to the stars, a quirk the alien councils tolerated only because they viewed humans as weak, docile traitors. That illusion shattered on a Tuesday. The Varakian hegemony was expanding its borders. They were a species of towering, obsidian-scaled bipeds who valued strength above all. Their regional commander, Warlord Corvin, arrived at Aegis Prime with a dreadnought and a simple demand. The station would now pay protection taxes to the hegemony, or it would be reduced to slag. To make his point, Corvin and a heavily armed retinue of shock troops strode through the commercial promenade, overturning stalls and shoving citizens aside. Jack happened to be walking back from the supply depot, carrying a crate of plasma coils. Barnaby was walking off-leash, happily sniffing a dropped ration bar near a ventilation grate. Corvin's massive armored boots pounded down the corridor. Barnaby, startled by the aggressive approach and the smell of ozone and sulfur radiating from the aliens, did what any protective terrier would do. He stood his ground between Jack and the Warlord, planted his paws, and let out a sharp, warning bark. Corvin paused. He looked down at the small, furry creature. To the Warlord, anything that challenged him was either a threat to be neutralized or a pest to be crushed. "Filthy vermin!" Corvin hissed in his clicking, guttural tongue. Before Jack could even drop the crate, Corvin drew back his massive, steel-plated leg and kicked. The sound was sickening. A heavy, wet crunch echoed through the promenade, followed by a high-pitched yelp that was cut brutally short. Barnaby was launched 20 feet through the air, slamming hard against a steel bulkhead before sliding down, leaving a streak of red. He didn't move. Silence fell over the promenade. The human merchants gasped, stepping back in terror. Jack dropped the crate. The plasma coils shattered on the deck. He didn't look at Corvin. He didn't yell. He simply walked past the towering alien, his eyes locked on the broken, furry form on the deck. Corvin let out a booming laugh. "Let that be a lesson to the rest of you fragile apes," the Warlord announced to the terrified crowd. "Keep your pests leashed, and your heads bowed." He turned and marched toward the docking bays, leaving Jack kneeling in a pool of blood. Jack scooped Barnaby up. The dog was breathing, but barely. His ribs were shattered, his breathing shallow and ragged. Jack carried him in a dead sprint to the station's medical wing, kicking the door off its hinges to get to Dr. David Miller. "David, fix him." Jack's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried a weight that made the doctor's blood run cold. Dr. Miller rushed the dog onto the surgical table. "Jack, I don't know. The internal trauma is massive. His lung is punctured. I'll do everything I can, but you need to prepare yourself." Jack stood outside the operating room, his hands coated in Barnaby's blood. He stared at his hands for a long time. The warm, gentle mechanic that the station knew slowly faded away, replaced by something cold, ancient, and terrifying. Jack pulled out a heavily encrypted personal communicator, a device he hadn't charged in a decade. He bypassed the station's network, tapping directly into a classified deep space relay. The screen flickered to life, showing the face of a gray-haired man in a crisp uniform. "Jack?" the man said, surprised. "It's been 10 years. I thought you were done." "Thomas," Jack said softly, "I need a favor." General Thomas Sterling of the United Earth Defense Command leaned forward, seeing the look in his old friend's eyes. What happened? A Varakian warlord named Corvin just put my dog on life support, Jack said. His voice was devoid of emotion, which was what terrified Thomas the most. I need his fleet coordinates. And Thomas? Yes? Jack? I'm invoking Directive 7. Thomas turned pale. Directive 7 wasn't a military maneuver. It was an extinction-level contingency. Jack, you can't be serious. Over a dog? The politicians will never authorize. I don't care what the politicians authorize, Jack interrupted. Barnaby was my wife's dog. Now, are you going to give me those coordinates, or do I need to start dismantling the Varakian Empire blind? Thomas sighed, his fingers already typing on his console. God help them, Jack. I'll send the data. Happy hunting. To the rest of the galaxy, humanity was a Tier 3 species, a designation given to peaceful traders, agricultural worlds, and mid-level engineers. What the Galactic Council didn't know, and what humanity had desperately tried to keep secret, was why they were so peaceful. Humanity hadn't reached the stars through enlightenment. They had reached the stars through the necessity of war. They were a species that had perfected the art of violence, mastered it, and then grown terrified of their own reflection. When they finally broke the faster-than-light barrier, they saw a galaxy filled with fragile empires and decided to hide their fangs. They disarmed their dreadnoughts, retrofitted their orbital Mac cannons into mining lasers, and masqueraded as harmless merchants. Jack Halloway wasn't a mechanic. 10 years ago, he was Commander Halloway, the commander of the Tier 1 Special Operations Unit known as the Hounds. He was the man who had single-handedly broken the back of the Krell insurgency. Back in the medical bay, Dr. Miller stepped out. He looked exhausted. He's stabilized, Jack. I had to replace his left lung with a synthetic filter, and his spine is fused, but he's alive. He's a fighter. Jack let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for a century. Watch him, David. Keep him safe. I have an errand to run. Jack descended into the bowels of Aegis Prime. Deep in Sublevel 9, behind a bulkhead welded shut years ago, lay a storage locker. Jack torched the lock. Inside, bathed in the hum of emergency lighting, was a matte black crate bearing the faded logo of Lockheed Martin's Deep Space Division. He opened it. The armor inside wasn't shiny or heroic. It was utilitarian, brutal, and covered in radar-absorbent materials. He strapped on the exosuit, the servos whining as they synced with his neural port. He loaded a custom-built, chemically propelled kinetic rifle, a primitive weapon by galactic standards, where lasers were the norm. But energy shields were designed to stop heat and light. They weren't designed to stop a depleted uranium slug traveling at Mach 5. Meanwhile, Warlord Corvin had returned to his dreadnought, the Bloodied Talon, anchored just outside the station's defense perimeter. He was drafting a report to High Minister Xylos back on the Varakian homeworld. The station is secured, Minister, Corvin growled into the comms. The humans are cowards. I disciplined one of their filthy beasts, and the owner did nothing. They will pay the tribute. Excellent, Minister Xylos replied, his reptilian eyes blinking slowly. The humans have vast resource wealth. Bleed them dry. Corvin's comms officer suddenly interrupted. Warlord, we have a breach on the lower docking bay. A breach? Did a civilian ship crash? No, sir. It's a single biological entity. It just blew the airlock doors using an archaic explosive compound. It's moving through the ship. Corvin sneered. Send a squad of shock troops. Kill the intruder and hang its corpse on the hull. Down in the lower decks, Jack Halloway walked through the corridors of the Bloodied Talon. The artificial gravity was heavy, designed for the massive Varakians, but his exosuit compensated perfectly. A squad of 6 8-foot-tall Varakian soldiers rounded the corner, their plasma rifles raised. They barked orders at him to surrender. Jack didn't slow his pace. He raised his kinetic rifle and squeezed the trigger. The deafening scrack of chemically propelled munitions in a confined space ruptured the eardrums of the aliens. The depleted uranium slugs punched straight through their kinetic energy shields, shattering their thick obsidian armor like glass. 6 bodies hit the floor before the first shell casing clattered against the deck. Jack stepped over them, his face hidden behind a polarized visor. He wasn't rushing, he was methodical. He moved through the ship with the chilling efficiency of a machine executing a perfectly coded program. Every bulkhead they locked, he blew open. Every ambush they set, he flanked and eradicated. He was a ghost of humanity's violent past, resurrected by a single act of cruelty. Up on the bridge, Corvin watched the security feeds in growing horror. His elite soldiers, veterans of a dozen planetary conquests, were being slaughtered by a single human. The human wasn't even using cover. He was simply walking forward, an unstoppable force of nature, painting the corridors with Varakian blood. "Seal the blast doors to the bridge!" Corvan roared, his previous arrogance entirely evaporated. "Get us out of here! Spool up the slipspace drives!" "Sir, the drives are offline," the helmsman panicked. The intruder bypassed the main reactor on his way up. He disabled the magnetic containment fields. "If we engage the drives, the ship will tear itself apart." Corvin realized he was trapped. The Warlord drew his heavy plasma sword, standing behind the reinforced blast doors of the bridge. "Let him come!" Corvin snarled, trying to mask his fear. "No weapon can breach that door." A moment later, a small, disc-shaped device magnetically clamped onto the center of the blast door. It emitted a high-pitched whine. Boom! A shaped charge, a piece of ancient Earth engineering designed specifically to turn reinforced armor into liquid shrapnel, blew the door inward. The concussive wave knocked the bridge crew to the deck. Through the smoke, Jack Halloway stepped onto the bridge. Corvin lunged, swinging his plasma sword in a deadly arc aimed at Jack's neck. Jack didn't dodge. He raised his left arm, engaging a hard-light buckler, a piece of black market tech he'd scavenged years ago. The plasma blade sparked and hissed against the shield. With his right hand, Jack drove the butt of his kinetic rifle directly into Corvin's knee joint. The alien warlord roared in pain, dropping to one knee. Before Corvin could recover, Jack dropped his rifle, grabbed the warlord by the throat plating, and slammed him onto the command console. Jack drew a serrated combat knife, pressing it directly against the soft tissue beneath Corvin's jaw. "You like kicking things that are smaller than you?" Jack whispered, his voice transmitted clearly through the suit's external speakers. Corvin gasped, his eyes wide with a terror he had never known. You are just an ape." "I'm a human," Jack corrected softly, "and you touched my dog." Jack didn't kill him. Death was too quick, too merciful. Instead, Jack drove the combat knife through Corvin's right shoulder, pinning the warlord to his own command console. Corvin screamed. Jack accessed the ship's primary communications array, overriding the encryption protocols using a brute force algorithm provided by Thomas Sterling. He opened a direct, unencrypted channel to the Varakian homeworld, straight to the office of High Minister Xylos. The screen lit up, showing the bewildered High Minister. He looked at the feed, seeing his most feared warlord pinned to a console, bleeding out, with a human standing over him. "What is the meaning of this?" Xylos demanded, his frills flaring in outrage. "Human, you have committed an act of war against the Varakian hegemony. Our fleets will reduce your dirt ball of a home planet to ash." "Your fleets won't make it out of their dry docks," Jack replied calmly. "You made a mistake, Minister. You assumed we were weak because we chose to be polite. Now, I'm taking that choice away." As Jack spoke, alarms began to blare in the background of Minister Xylos's office. Panic erupted off-screen. "Minister!" an aide's voice shrieked. "Slipspace ruptures detected! Massive energy signatures appearing in orbit!" High Minister Xylos turned to his tactical display. What he saw made his blood run cold. When Jack had called Thomas Sterling, the general hadn't just given him coordinates. He had sent an alert to the United Earth Defense Command. The sleeping giant had been violently awoken. In the skies above the Varakian homeworld, the illusion of human weakness shattered. Over 300 human warships dropped out of slipspace. But these weren't the blocky, slow-moving merchant vessels the aliens were used to seeing. These were Nimitz-class stellar carriers, heavily armored battlecruisers, and sleek stealth frigates. They blotted out the sun. Leading the vanguard was Admiral James Mitchell aboard the super dreadnought Retribution. Admiral Mitchell broadcast a system-wide message, overpowering every screen, every comms unit, and every datapad on the Varakian homeworld. The image of the grim-faced human admiral appeared everywhere. "People of the Varakian hegemony," Mitchell's voice echoed through their cities. "For a century, humanity has restrained itself. We signed your treaties, paid your tariffs, and endured your insults because we know the horrors of total war. But Your warlord Corvin crossed a line that humanity does not forgive. He assaulted a human's canine companion. The Varakian populace watched in utter confusion and mounting terror. They were being invaded over a pet? We do not negotiate with animal abusers, Mitchell continued. Your defense grid is offline. Your orbital weapons platforms have been remotely disabled. Surrender Warlord Corvin's command structure. Dismantle your fleets and beg for mercy. You have 1 hour. Back on the bloodied Talon, Minister Xylos looked back at the screen, staring at Jack. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by the crushing realization that he had doomed his entire species. Please, Xylos begged, his voice trembling. It was one animal. It was a mistake. We will pay reparations. We will give you a sector of space. Just call off your fleet. Jack reached down, grabbed the hilt of his knife, and twisted it slightly, eliciting another scream from Corvin. My dog, Jack said coldly, leaning into the camera, isn't for sale. Jack severed the connection. He left Corvin pinned to the console, bleeding and humiliated for his own crew to find. Jack didn't need to destroy the ship. The human fleet had already blockaded the system. The war was over before the hegemony even realized it had begun. Jack walked back to the airlock, his boots heavy on the deck plates. He stepped into his shuttle, disengaged the docking clamps, and set a course back to Aegis Prime. The entire galaxy was burning. Empires were surrendering, and trillions of aliens were rapidly learning the concept of human retribution. But Jack didn't care about the geopolitics. He didn't care about the collapsing Varakian economy or the frantic apologies pouring into Earth's diplomatic channels. He just needed to get back to level 4. He needed to check on his dog. The Galactic Cooperative Council convened on the capital world of Oakhaven, a lush, neutral planet where the galaxy's elite bickered over trade routes and mineral rights. For 70 years, the human delegation had sat quietly in the back rows, occasionally raising a hand to request lower tariffs on agricultural exports. They were viewed as the galaxy's farmers, a timid species that had somehow stumbled into faster-than-light travel. On this particular Wednesday, the human delegate, Ambassador Evelyn Hayes, did not sit in the back. She walked directly to the center podium, her heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. The grand amphitheater, filled with thousands of representatives from 100 different species, fell into a deathly silence. Above the podium, massive holographic displays projected real-time footage from the Varakian homeworld. The mighty Varakian defense grid, a marvel of alien engineering, was currently being dismantled piece by Earth's Nimitz-class stellar carriers. Ambassador Hayes adjusted her microphone. She didn't look angry. She looked incredibly, terrifyingly disappointed. For decades, the Galactic Cooperative has asked Earth why we spend so much of our GDP on classified orbital projects, Hayes began, her voice echoing through the chamber. You assumed we were building defensive shields. You assumed we were hiding our wealth. But the truth is much simpler. We were hiding our nature. She pressed a button on her console. The hologram shifted, revealing classified schematics that had been hidden in the dark web of Earth's military-industrial complex. This is the Oppenheimer Protocol, Hayes stated coldly, a joint initiative by the Northrop Grumman Interstellar Division and General Dynamics Space Operations. When we first reached the stars, we realized our history of warfare was uniquely brutal. No other species fought quite like us. We feared that if we brought our military doctrines into the broader galaxy, we would become the monsters of this universe. So, we locked our weapons away. We put our Tier 1 operators in civilian jobs. We put a leash on the beast. She paused, locking eyes with the Varakian ambassador, whose obsidian scales had turned a sickly shade of gray. Warlord Corvin, Hayes continued, her voice dropping an octave, decided to test that leash. He traveled to Aegis Prime and brutally assaulted a 30-pound canine belonging to one of our retired commanders. He didn't just hurt a pet. He reminded humanity that the galaxy is not a civilized place, and if the galaxy is not civilized, humanity has no reason to pretend to be. The chamber erupted into panicked whispers. The sheer disproportion of the human response was incomprehensible to the alien mind. They were dismantling a multi-system empire over a non-sapient quadruped? Ambassador Hayes, the High Chancellor of the Council, stammered, his tentacles trembling. Surely, this is an overreaction. A single warlord's actions cannot justify the total annihilation of the Varakian hegemony. We demand you recall Admiral James Mitchell's fleet immediately. Hayes offered a thin, humorless smile. We aren't annihilating them, Chancellor. We are disarming them. We are taking away their toys until they learn how to play nicely. The Varakian hegemony will surrender their entire fleet to the United Earth Defense Command. They will pay for the medical expenses of the injured canine, and they will formally apologize. If they refuse, the blockade stands until their economy starves. This is not a negotiation. While Earth was dictating terms to the galaxy, the situation on the edge of the Perseus Arm was far from stable. The Varakian homeworld was completely locked down, but the hegemony was vast, and not all of its commanders were ready to bow to a species they considered prey. Commander Thrax, the ruthless second-in-command to the crippled Warlord Corvan, was currently orbiting a gas giant 3 sectors away. He was aboard the Shadow's Edge, a prototype Varakian stealth frigate equipped with light-bending thermal cloaks. Thrax watched the transmission of Earth's demands with boiling rage. His species worshipped strength. To surrender without a fight was a fate worse than death. The homeworld is paralyzed by fear. Thrax growled to his bridge crew, his mandibles clicking furiously. They are bowing to apes. We will not suffer this humiliation. Commander, his tactical officer hesitated. The human fleet. Their weapons bypass our kinetic shields completely. They use solid matter, accelerated to impossible speeds. We cannot fight their armada. We don't need to fight their armada, Thrax sneered. We just need to break their spirit. This entire display of force is tied to one human and his beast. We know he is on the Aegis Prime station. We slip past their sensors, breach the station, and execute the human. We broadcast the death of the human and the beast to the galaxy. We will show these humans that their Oppenheimer protocol does not scare us. The Shadow's Edge engaged its cloaking drive, vanishing from the visible spectrum and masking its heat signature. It slipped into slipspace, setting a direct course for Aegis Prime. Back on the station, Jack Halloway had shed his heavy Lockheed Martin exosuit. He was back in his grease-stained mechanic's overalls, sitting in a plastic chair in the sterile white hallway of the station's medical wing. His hands, still stained with dried blood and engine oil, were folded in his lap. Dr. David Miller stepped out of the surgical suite. He was consulting a datapad provided by the Johns Hopkins Extrasolar Medical Annex, Earth's premier off-world biological research facility. "Jack," David said softly, taking a seat next to the mechanic. "How is he?" Jack didn't look up. His eyes were fixed on the floor tiles. "He's fighting," David sighed, rubbing his temples. "I've pumped him full of synthetic coagulants, and the biofoam is holding his internal organs together. But Jack, he's old. His heart is struggling under the strain of the trauma. I've placed him in a medically induced coma inside the stasis pod. It's up to him now. If his body accepts the synthetic lung filter, he might pull through." Jack slowly nodded, his jaw tight. "Can I sit with him?" "Of course," David said, opening the door to the intensive care unit. The room was dim, illuminated only by the soft blue glow of the stasis pod. Barnaby looked incredibly small inside the reinforced glass cylinder. Tubes and monitors were attached to his scruffy body, mapping his fading vitals. Jack pulled up a stool and sat beside the pod. He placed a calloused hand against the cold glass. "You're a good boy, Barnaby," Jack whispered, his voice cracking for the first time since the incident. "You held the line. Just hold it a little longer, okay? Don't leave me alone out here." For 3 hours, the station was quiet. The humans on board Aegis Prime watched the news feeds in awe, realizing for the first time who they had been sharing their promenade with. Jack Halloway, the quiet mechanic who fixed their vaporators for half price, had just overthrown a galactic superpower. But the quiet was shattered at 0400 hours local station time. The emergency klaxons didn't sound, the power didn't flicker. But Jack, whose instincts had been honed in the darkest trenches of the Krell insurgency, felt the shift in air pressure. He heard the faint, high-frequency hum of a localized gravity dampener, a tool used by boarding parties to breach hulls without triggering explosive decompression sensors. Jack stood up slowly. He looked at the vital monitors above Barnaby's pod. He couldn't move the dog. If he unhooked the stasis life support, Barnaby would die in minutes. Dr. Miller rushed into the room, looking confused. "Jack, my comms just went dead. The internal network is totally jammed." "They're here," Jack said. The cold, mechanical detachment returned to his eyes. He wasn't the grieving pet owner anymore. He was the Hound. Who? David asked, his voice shaking. Varakians. A hit squad. They've bypassed the station's security grid. Jack turned to the doctor. David, lock the blast doors to this ward. Do not open them for anyone except me. If they breach the door, you use the emergency atmospheric scrubbers to flood the antechamber with anesthetic gas. What are you going to do? David asked, looking at Jack's grease-stained overalls. You don't have your armor. You don't have a weapon. Jack walked to a medical supply cabinet, smashing the glass with his elbow. He pulled out 2 heavy tungsten carbide bone saws, designed for amputating heavy alien appendages, and a high-voltage cardiac defibrillator unit. I have everything I need, Jack said. He stepped out of the intensive care unit, pulling the heavy steel door shut behind him. Commander Thrax and his strike team of 8 elite Varakian assassins moved silently through the maintenance shafts of Aegis Prime. They were equipped with light-bending camouflage suits, rendering them nearly invisible to the naked eye. They carried silenced plasma repeaters, designed to melt flesh without making a sound. They reached the corridor outside the medical wing. The lights were out. The only illumination came from the red glow of the emergency exit signs. Thrax signaled his men to fan out. They activated their thermal visors, sweeping the hallway. Nothing. The corridor was empty. Breach the doors, Thrax whispered into his internal comms. Kill the doctor. Kill the human. Burn the beast. 2 assassins stepped forward, attaching a thermal breaching charge to the medical wing's main blast doors. From the ceiling above them, a ventilation grate quietly unscrewed and fell, caught silently by a pair of human hands. Jack dropped into the hallway directly behind the rearguard assassin. The Varakian didn't even have time to turn around. Jack jammed the high-voltage defibrillator paddles directly into the weak points of the alien's neck plating and cranked the dial to maximum yield. A massive surge of raw electricity coursed through the Varakian's nervous system, instantly short-circuiting his heart and his cloaking suit. The alien dropped with a heavy thud, visible once again. The strike team spun around, raising their rifles. But Jack was already moving. He didn't fight like a soldier relying on overwhelming firepower. He fought like an apex predator in a closed environment. He grabbed the dropped plasma repeater from the twitching alien, using it as a blunt instrument to smash the thermal visor of the nearest assassin. As the alien recoiled, blinded, Jack drove the tungsten carbide bone saw deep into the gap under the alien's armpit, severing the primary brachial artery. Plasma fire erupted in the dark hallway, melting the walls and ceiling as the panicked Varakians fired blindly at the moving shadow. "Spread out! Use your wide beam settings!" Thrax roared, his arrogance rapidly giving way to terror. The human was moving too fast. He was using the tight confines of the hallway to neutralize their numbers advantage. Jack threw the heavy bone saw like a throwing axe. It embedded itself deep into the chest plating of a third assassin, throwing the massive alien backward into his comrades. Jack lunged forward, sliding under a sweep of plasma fire. He grabbed the ankle of a Varakian, pulled violently to shatter the knee joint, and used the falling alien as a meat shield against the crossfire of his own squad. To the Varakians, this was a nightmare. They were the galaxy's most feared conquerors, biologically engineered for dominance. Yet, they were being dismantled by a squishy, unarmored ape who was armed with medical tools and sheer, unadulterated rage. Thrax watched his squad fall one by one. The human didn't roar. He didn't boast. The only sounds in the hallway were the heavy thuds of Varakian bodies hitting the floor and the ragged, controlled breathing of the human. Within 3 minutes, the hallway was silent. 6 of the assassins were dead. 2 were bleeding out on the floor. Thrax was the last one standing. He stood by the blast doors of the medical wing, his plasma repeater empty, his cloaking suit sparking and failing. Jack stood at the end of the hallway, bathed in the red emergency light. He was bleeding from a grazing plasma burn on his left shoulder, but he didn't seem to notice. He slowly picked up a discarded combat knife from the floor, wiping the blade on his overalls. "You," Thrax gasped, dropping his empty weapon and drawing his ceremonial short sword. "You are not a merchant. You are a demon." "I told your boss," Jack said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "I'm a human." Thrax, charged with a desperate, guttural scream, swinging the heavy blade in a downward arc. Jack sidestepped with fluid grace, grabbing Thrax's wrist. Using the alien's own momentum, Jack twisted the arm backward, snapping the joint with a sickening crack. Thrax dropped the sword, falling to his knees. Jack stood behind him, the edge of the combat knife pressed against the back of the commander's neck. "You're cloaking ship," Jack said calmly. "It's transmitting a live feed back to your surviving fleets, isn't it?" Thrax swallowed hard. "Yes." "Good." Jack reached over and tapped the communication module on Thrax's shoulder armor, opening the channel to maximum broadcast strength. The audio feed would reach every Varakian ship hiding in the outer sectors. "Listen to me very carefully." Jack spoke into the comms, his voice projecting across light years. "My name is Jack Halloway. For the last 10 years, humanity has let you play your little games of empire because we simply did not care enough to stop you. But you came into my home. You hurt my family. This strike team was your last mistake." Jack pressed the blade slightly harder. "Earth isn't just blockading your homeworld anymore," Jack continued. "Admiral Mitchell has his orders. If a single Varakian ship jumps out of its designated sector, the Oppenheimer Protocol goes hot. We won't just break your fleets. We will glass your shipyards. We will crack your military outposts. We will send you back to the Stone Age. Surrender completely, right now, or we will erase the Varakian hegemony from the galactic history books." There was a long, agonizing silence over the comms. The Varakian admirals, listening to the brutal defeat of their greatest commando unit at the hands of a single, unarmored human, felt their will to fight completely evaporate. They had awakened a species of persistence predators, a race that viewed total war as a casual necessity. A voice crackled over the comms. It was the interim leader of the Varakian military command. "This is Fleet Admiral Kalen," the voice said, broken and defeated. "We surrender. We accept all terms of the Earth Defense Command. We are powering down our weapons. Please, spare us." Jack let out a long exhale. He pulled the knife away from Thrax's neck. "Tell your commander to stay on the floor," Jack said. "Station security will be here in a minute to collect him." Jack turned his back on the humiliated Varakian and walked to the medical wing's blast door. He typed in the override code. The door hissed open. Dr. Miller was standing there, pale and shaking, holding a surgical laser like a pistol. When he saw Jack covered in alien blood but standing tall, he dropped the laser. "Jack," David breathed. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Jack said, walking past the doctor, ignoring his own burns. He walked back into the intensive care unit. The soft blue glow of the stasis pod illuminated the dark room. Jack pulled his stool back to the side of the pod and sat down. The adrenaline of the fight was fading, leaving behind a profound, heavy exhaustion. He looked at the vital monitors. The erratic red lines of Barnaby's heartbeat had stabilized into a steady, green rhythm. Dr. Miller walked in behind him, checking the datapad. A massive smile broke out across the doctor's face. "Jack," David whispered, "his internal bleeding has stopped. The synthetic lung is functioning at 95% capacity. The stasis pod did its job." Jack leaned forward, pressing his forehead against the cool glass of the pod. For the first time since the Warlord's boot had connected with his best friend, a tear escaped Jack's eye, cutting a clean path through the dirt and grease on his face. Inside the pod, Barnaby's eyes fluttered. He couldn't move his body much, bound by the medical restraints and the healing foam. But as the dog looked through the glass and saw Jack's face, a low, happy thump, thump, thump echoed inside the chamber. Barnaby was wagging his tail. Jack smiled, a genuine, warm smile that the galaxy hadn't seen in days. "Hey, buddy," Jack whispered. "You did good. You did real good." 3 months later, the galaxy had been forever changed. The Varakian hegemony was dissolved, replaced by a demilitarized republic under the strict oversight of the United Earth Defense Command. The Galactic Cooperative Council officially reclassified humanity from a Tier 3 agricultural species to a Tier 1 apex military power. But humanity didn't conquer the galaxy. They didn't build an empire of their own. Just as the Varakians surrendered, the massive human armada quietly packed up and jumped back to their home sectors. The terrifying giant went back to sleep. However, Ambassador Evelyn Hayes did push one new, non-negotiable law through the Galactic Council. It was officially designated as the Interspecies Non-Sapient Protection Act, though everyone on Earth and across the stars simply called it the Barnaby Treaty. The law stated that any unprovoked harm brought upon a companion animal belonging to a Terran citizen would be treated as a Class A war crime, punishable by immediate and overwhelming military force. No alien species ever questioned the treaty. They had learned their lesson. Back on the orbital station Aegis Prime, life had returned to a comfortable, mundane rhythm. Down on level 4, the repair bay was busy. Jack Halloway was under the chassis of a civilian freighter, ratcheting a bolt on a plasma manifold. He wiped his brow, sliding out from under the ship. Sitting nearby on a plush, orthopedically designed bed provided by the highest-ranking veterinarians on Earth was Barnaby. The terrier mix was a little slower now, and he walked with a slight limp, but his eyes were bright, and his spirit was unbroken. He held a grease-stained wrench in his mouth. Jack laughed, taking the wrench and scratching Barnaby behind the ears. "Thanks, partner. Couldn't have done it without you." Barnaby let out a happy bark, a sound that, to the rest of the galaxy, was now considered the most terrifying warning siren in existence. But to Jack, it was just the sound of home. If you loved this story of ultimate human loyalty and galactic retribution, hit that like button to show your support for man's best friend. Don't forget to share this video with fellow sci-fi lovers and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY stories where humanity proves exactly why we should never be underestimated. Drop a comment below. What would you do if an alien warlord crossed your pet? Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next story.
Hi, my name is Tran Trung, the owner and manager of Palace Truths. After watching the video, the alien warlord hurt a human's dog. Now the entire Galactic Empire is begging for mercy, _HFY. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stood out to me most was how personal the conflict became the moment the dog was harmed. In a lot of HFY stories, humans can tolerate threats against themselves for a long time, but hurting something loyal and innocent crosses a completely different line. That mix of loyalty, anger and protection gave the story a really intense emotional energy. I also think the story reminds us how deeply people bond with the ones they care about, even in a galaxy filled with power and war. Sometimes compassion and loyalty reveal more about humanity than strength ever could. Do you think the alien warlord understood too late what he had triggered? And which moment in the story hit you the hardest? Thanks for spending time with Palace Truths today. If this story meant something to you, feel free to leave a comment and maybe like or subscribe for more HFY sci-fi stories like this.